water. More than 10,800 people have now been killed in Gaza, almost 70% of them women and children. On average, a child is killed every 10 minutes in Gaza. 1.5 million people have been displaced and are looking for shelter anywhere they can find it. But nowhere and no one is safe. Nowhere and no one is safe. As more and more people move to a smaller and smaller space, overcrowding is increasing the risks of outbreaks of diarrheal and respiratory disease and skin infections. Of course, WHO is on the ground in Gaza, alongside our partners to support health workers who are physically and mentally exhausted and are doing their best in unimaginable conditions. In addition to caring for the 27,000 people who are wounded, many of them with life-threatening injuries, they're trying to manage the regular health needs of more than 2 million people. More than 180 women give birth in Gaza every single day. There are 9,000 patients on cancer therapy, and there are 350,000 patients with diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension. I visited Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza 5 years ago in 2018. I toured a dialysis ward and a neonatal intensive care unit and spoke with health workers and patients. Even then, in 2018 in Gaza, conditions were extremely difficult for health workers. Now their work is impossible, and they're directly in the firing line. Since the 7th of October, WHO has verified more than 250 attacks on healthcare in Gaza and the West Bank, in addition to 25 attacks on healthcare in Israel: hospitals, clinics, patients, ambulances. Last week, WHO documented 5 attacks on 5 hospitals in one day. In the past 48 hours alone, 4 hospitals have been put out of action, representing some 430 beds. More than 100 of our UN colleagues have been killed and counting. And as we speak, there are reports of firing outside the Al-Shifa and Rantisi hospitals. Half of the Gaza Strip's 36 hospitals and 2/3 of its primary healthcare centers are not functioning at all. Those that are functioning are operating way beyond their capacities. The health system is on its knees, and yet somehow it's continuing to deliver some life-saving care. The best way to support those health workers and the people they serve is by giving them the tools they need to deliver that care: medicines, medical equipment, and fuel for hospital generators. Field hospitals and emergency medical teams can complement and support existing hospitals and health workers in Gaza, but they cannot replace them. Supporting Gaza's health workers is at the heart of WHO's operational response plan. WHO was part of the first convoy of aid to enter Gaza through the Rafah crossing on the 21st of October. And since then, we have delivered 63 metric tons of specialist medical equipment and supplies that health workers need to save lives, including to hospitals north of Wadi Gaza. But this doesn't even begin to address the scale of need. It's too small. Before the 7th of October, an average of 500 trucks a day were crossing into Gaza with essential supplies. Since the 21st of October, instead of the expected 10,000 trucks, just 650 have entered. A month ago, just 2 days after the violence started, I met with His Excellency President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, who agreed to support WHO and our partners to deliver aid through the Rafah crossing. I thank Egypt for its support in getting aid into Gaza and for establishing a medevac pathway to get the most critically sick and wounded patients out, including 12 children with cancer who are being transferred for treatment in Egypt and Jordan. WHO continues to call for unfettered access to deliver humanitarian aid to the civilians of Gaza, who are not responsible for this violence, but are suffering in ways that we in this room cannot imagine. We continue to call on Hamas to release the hostage it took, many of whom need urgent medical attention. We continue to call on Israel to restore supplies of electricity, water, and especially fuel. We continue to call on both sides to abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law. And we continue to call for a ceasefire to prevent further deaths of civilians and further damage to Gaza's hospitals and health facilities. Mr. President, Excellencies, I understand what the children of Gaza must be going through, because as a child, I went through the same thing, the same. The sound of gunfire and shells whistling through the air, the smell of smoke after they struck, tracer bullets in the night sky, the fear, the pain, the loss. These things have stayed with me throughout my life. I know the smell, the image of war. I know what war means. When my mother heard gunfire at night, she would make us sleep under the bed with more mattresses on top of one bed, in the hope we might be protected if a shell fell on our house, a mother's instinct to save her kids. I also understand what the parents of Gaza are going through, because in 1998, when war returned to Ethiopia, my country, my children had to hide in a bunker to shelter from the bombardment. I experienced war both as a child and as a parent. I know how the children are feeling, and I know how the parents are also feeling. The children and parents of Gaza and Israel want and need the same thing that my family wanted and needed: peace and security. By the way, I never imagined that I would be the Director General of the World Health Organization, because my mother's prayer was to survive just one day. One day. Maybe I'm lucky. That's what this council was established to achieve: peace and security. But this crisis underlines once again the need for reform of the Security Council. I felt nostalgic, by the way, when I entered into the room, because I used to come here when I was foreign minister. It has long been my view that the Security Council no longer serves the purpose for which it was established. And reminding this with all due respect, it represents the real politic of the Second World War, not the 21st century. As a foreign minister, I was part of a group working on reform of the Security Council. I'm dismayed that no progress has been made. To remain credible, relevant, and a force for peace in our world, member states, especially the P5, must take seriously the need to reform the Security Council. And one ask for today is a ceasefire and a path towards peace. I thank you. And Chair, Mr. President, back to you.
我感谢谭德赛先生所做的通报。我现在请吉拉尼先生通报情况。
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, thank you for giving me the opportunity to address this very important meeting of the Security Council. Mr. President, the health sector in Gaza is under attack. Hospitals are being deliberately targeted in a desperate attempt to force the civilian population out of Gaza. The last 24 hours saw the targeting of at least 4 hospitals in Gaza. Al-Shifa Hospital, with tens of thousands of people sheltering there. Al-Auda Hospital, where our ambulances were bombarded and the emergency paramedics miraculously escaped certain death yesterday. Also the Indonesian hospital and our Al-Quds Hospital. Mr. President, I had to rewrite this statement few times in the last few hours, as the situation around the hospitals is changing by the minute. Displaced people at the hospitals are getting shot at as we speak. During the last call with my colleagues at Al-Quds Hospital 2 hours ago, they told me that 20 people have been injured by direct firing at the hospital. 1 person has been killed. They are asking, what can they do? Where should they go? Thousands of innocent lives are under imminent threat of being killed. I'm calling upon the council members on behalf of the staff and volunteers of the emergency medical teams, the doctors and nurses who are besieged in Gaza hospitals, to do all you can to spare further deaths and sufferings. There are 14,000 displaced civilians at Al-Quds Hospital, in addition to 400 sick and wounded, together with our medical teams and management. The main generator was shut off 2 days ago because of lack of fuel. Right now, there is a very serious risk that we will lose all the patients in the intensive care units and those children in incubators. Mr. President, I was prepared to inform the Council about the critical shortages of fuel, food, and water. But honestly, now our utmost concern is the direct threat to the lives of all those wounded and sick, together with tens of thousands of civilians, including thousands of children. They are looking at you, imploring you to act to stop another possible massacre unfolding. In addition to the imminent threat of being shot and killed, the 14,000 displaced civilians at the hospital are getting restless and desperate because of lack of water, food, and electricity. We are witnessing the spread of diseases and increasing infestation of wounds with worms and among children. A child was treated yesterday for eye infection. The doctor found worms in his eyes. Mr. President, the medical teams have left their families to help save the lives of the wounded and the sick. but many of them received the news of losing so many loved ones. Dr. Nabil, a board member and now a volunteer at Al-Quds Hospital, lost 36 members of his family. The chair of our board has lost 20 members of his family. One of the founders of PRCS lost in one day 20 members, and the next day, another 13. The description of the situation at Al-Quds Hospital does not and cannot describe the absolute horrors, the trauma, and the psychological scars of sleeping every night under the terrorizing bombardment and not knowing whether they will be alive the next morning or not. Mr. President, PRCS is taking the main responsibility to receive humanitarian aid through the Rafah crossing and distribute it to humanitarian organizations and to the hospitals and shelters. What has come in so far represents less than what used to get into Gaza in 2 days. At the same time, there has not been any drop of fuel that entered Gaza, which is essential for every aspect of life, for hospital operations, for pumping water, for bakeries, for ambulances, and for the trucks which are transporting the humanitarian aid. If this prohibition on fuel continues, we will not be able to continue to receive this aid and distribute it. Furthermore, if no aid gets to the north of Gaza Strip, we will soon see infants dying because their mothers cannot feed them. Many people will starve and die of diseases. Mr. President, we call on the Security Council and the international community at large. One, to ensure an effective and immediate ceasefire is enforced. To ensure fuel gets into Gaza immediately to prevent additional unnecessary deaths and sufferings. Increase humanitarian aid and ensure that unconditional humanitarian aid gets to the north of Gaza, where tens of thousands of people are still there and have no safe places to go to. Ensure respect for international humanitarian law and the protection of medical missions and civilians in all parts of Gaza. Ensure hospitals continue to function with the needed support of fuel, medicine, medical supplies, and to allow medical teams to enter Gaza to relieve the teams who have been working tirelessly 24/7 for the past 35 days. Mr. President, Excellencies, please listen to the cries of children soaked in blood and asking why, and what have they done, and why the world is so indifferent to their lives. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢吉拉尼先生刚才所做的通报。我现在请观察员国巴勒斯坦常驻观察员发言。
Mr. President, I thank China, President of the Security Council, for convening this important meeting and for your leadership of the Council in these times of crisis. I also want to thank the briefers who have shared disturbing reflections on the facts of the catastrophic situation being faced by the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. Facts that should pain the human conscience. And to my brother Julani, I want to convey through him our salutations to the heroes of the Palestine Red Crescent in carrying out their mission to save lives. As we speak here, hospitals have become Israelis' primary target. They are besieged and their vicinity bombed. But what we should say to them from the Security Council, stop the massacre? Anyone? WHO can and must act now to stop these massacres. Mr. President, I'm an old man, old enough to have been born when the Nakba occurred, to have grown up in UNRWA tents and refugee camps alongside tens of thousands of Palestinians, and to have listened to the stories about our life before the Nakba, stemming from the vivid and wounded memory of my parents. My generation dedicated its entire life to putting an end to the Nakba. On this 75th anniversary of the Nakba, instead of seeing it end, we see images that remind us of the worst of our times. What will this generation in Gaza remember? The horrors, the massacres, the trucks carrying people, carrying lifeless bodies, and shattered hopes. They will remember walking with a small bag to fit the remains of life. Children injured, orphaned, traumatized, walking distances they should never explore, between death and displacement, between loss and loss. More rage and outrage, more pain and suffering, beyond what the human mind can comprehend, beyond what any human heart should have to bear. So much silence within, the noise of bombardments without. Our entire life, we scream but cannot be heard. How can you scream louder than all this death that surrounds you? How can you scream louder than the noise of the bombardments? I cannot bear these images of a human wave with no tears as their eyes dried up, with broken hearts. Small children carrying burdens that would break the shoulders of strong men, discovering the meaning of death before enjoying the taste of life. They are standing up, but everything else within them and around them has crumbled. The same suffering that traumatized my generation is now tormenting yet another Palestinian generation. We often said at that time, if the world knew, if it had witnessed our pain, if it had seen an entire people being killed and uprooted, it would have never allowed it to happen. We were so wrong. It did not matter that the massacres in Gaza are being reported live. They were being justified by pundits and spin doctors with all kinds of excuses. The fog disputed eventually, but only too late, and positions became clearer, but not yet clear enough to reign in Israel to tell it enough is enough. To be fair, the killer never hid his intentions, hiding his intentions. He spoke of mighty vengeance and human animals, describing us, and declared he would impose a terrifying siege on 2.3 million people, more than half of them children, more than 1.1 million children, flagrant collective punishment of an entire people. He called for the release of 200 hostages while taking over 2 million hostages in the process. He demanded condemnation of the killing of 1,000 Israeli civilians and killed 10,000 Palestinian civilians in the process. He proclaimed his right to self-defense while occupying, colonizing, and denying every right to the Palestinian people, including our right to self-determination and to protection and to defend ourselves. He preached of the need to prevent the destruction of Israel while continuing his campaign to destroy Palestine. He rejected any insinuation that Israel was not upholding the laws of war while committing war crimes and crimes against humanity on camera and while his representatives were unable to hide their genocidal intent. Bombs dropping everywhere, north, south, east, and west. Bombs dropping on schools, universities, hospitals, UN shelters, cars, convoys, people walking, ambulances, killing civilians, doctors, journalists, UN staff, humanitarian rescue teams. Where should Palestinians go? To the sea or out of the Gaza Strip? Israel begins surprise. Why are they staying? Why are they dying and not listening to them? Because our entire nation has experienced in its flesh the grand exodus. Even when facing imminent death, it hesitates before leaving. It is our national trauma. So they bomb and bomb and bomb civilians, children, and civilian infrastructure. They deprive our people of the objects essential for their survival. But don't you dare accuse them of forced transfer. Forget about the memo by the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence that says they want to displace us out of Gaza. Forget about the statement of their foreign minister about the fact Gaza would shrink after the war. Forget about the map that Netanyahu held in the General Assembly with Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, as part of Israel. Forget about the confession of Netanyahu that they intend to retain security control over Gaza. Forget the chants of their soldiers. Forget the speeches of their leaders. They are telling you, we just want the Palestinians to go south for their safety. Never mind that some Palestinians have made it all the way to Rafah and are still being bombed. What is south of Rafah? I wonder. They want us out of our country, out of our land. Their strategic enemy is the independence of our state, the freedom of our people. The only options they have ever given us: submit, leave or die, or in international legal terms, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, or genocide. Gaza has shown this is shocking terms. And in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Israeli occupation forces and settlers killed 350 Palestinians since the beginning of the year, half of them in the last month, and forcibly displaced hundreds more Palestinians, seizing large areas of land. Mr. President, the Security Council meets again. I count our meetings in Palestinian death, in devastations and destruction. We met first when hundreds of Palestinians had been killed. We met yet again when 11,000 have been killed in Gaza, including 4,500 children. We met, and you can hear in these halls, if you listen well, the shouts of our children under the rubble, abandoned by humanity. We meet as only a few hundred trucks have entered Gaza in 30 days, and 10 times more souls have left to the skies. Israel is allowing enough trucks to pretend it is not imposing the siege, but not enough to save lives. Israel is implementing imaginary humanitarian pauses whose only goal is to force people to flee, not to offer them some relief that their survival is guaranteed. Thank you, Mr. President.
感谢观察员国巴勒斯坦常驻观察员的发言。我现在请以色列代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank you for your consideration in permitting me to address the Council earlier in light of the Sabbath. It is deeply appreciated. Thank you. Distinguished Council members, the Holy Jewish Sabbath is a day of peace and rest. It is the day on which God rested following the creation of the world. Yet, no Jew will ever forget the Sabbath of October 7th. It has been seared into the collective trauma of the Jewish people forever. Exactly 85 years ago today, another traumatic atrocity was burned into the Jewish people's history. Between November 9th and 10th, 1938, the Jewish communities of Germany and Austria suffered Kristallnacht, the Nazis' November pogrom, which was the first hyper-violent exposure of the Nazis' murderous Jew hatred. Nearly 100 Jews were murdered. Thousands of Jewish homes, hospitals, schools, houses of worship, and businesses were ransacked and burned to the ground. Israelis endured another such pogrom 5 weeks ago. Yet, here we are 34 days later, and this Council still has not condemned Hamas's heinous, planned massacre of Israeli civilians. Should this Council, in its current form, existed in 1938, I doubt that the response would be much different. Council members, today's briefing focuses on the targeting of hospitals. Just 2 days ago, Barzilai Hospital in Ashkelon suffered a direct, intentional hit from Hamas rockets. Hamas's intentional targeting of hospitals is a war crime. Deliberate attacks on medical facilities, the murder of medical teams, paramedics, and ambulances sent to treat the wounded were rampant during the Hamas slaughter. Yet, these horrors have yet to be addressed by this Council. I urge the Council to invite me to share a screening of the footage from Hamas's slaughter, footage that the terrorists filmed themselves. Once you see the barbarity and savagery with your own eyes, you will understand the evil that Israel is defending itself against. Will you address these crimes today? Will you condemn Hamas for murdering Israeli medical personnel? Will you call out Hamas for torching Israeli ambulances? We have videos of Hamas Nazis shooting at ambulances to prevent any attempt to save innocents. Will you call out Hamas for indiscriminately firing rockets at Israeli hospitals? After all, this has been Hamas's modus operandi for years. For years. Will this be the focus of this meeting? What about Hamas's exploitation of hospitals, ambulances, and medical clinics for terror in Gaza? Will this be raised in today's meeting? Over the past week, Israel has exposed to the world that the Hamas Nazis' main command headquarters is located within and under Shifa Hospital. We have provided footage of terrorists existing tunnels adjacent to and underneath hospitals. We have shown videos of Hamas ISIS using ambulances as a means of transporting weapons and terrorists. We have shared intelligence, including phone calls between terrorists, stating that they not only are located under and inside hospitals, but that they also control the fuel supply to medical centers, which they exploit first and foremost for their terror activity. We have shared footage of Hamas terrorists who openly admit that Shifa Hospital and other hospitals serve as bases and that ambulances are used as taxis for terrorists. These terrorists make it clear that Hamas co-opts these vehicles and sensitive locations for their war machines, as they know that Israel will not attack them. Over the past 16 years, Hamas has turned every inch of Gaza into a terror trap. Nothing is sacred to these jihadist Nazis. Every medical worker, doctor, and patient in Gaza is a human shield for the Hamas terrorists. This is abominable. It is a war crime of epic proportions. Will this be the focus of today's meeting? How can we possibly hold a briefing on the medical situation in Gaza without making this the primary issue of this meeting? For weeks, Israel has asked all civilians to temporarily evacuate northern Gaza. We have dropped leaflets. We have made phone calls. We have sent text messages. For days, there has been designated corridors for civilians to evacuate south. Israel is providing safe passage for Gazan civilians to leave an active war zone, while Hamas is actively working to prevent civilians from leaving. In footage that surfaced today, Gazan civilians were waving white flags as they tried to leave Al-Nasser hospital, yet they were forced to stay after Hamas opened fire on them. Israel is at war with Hamas, and we have gone above and beyond to mitigate civilian casualties. For Israel, life is sacred. But yet, for Hamas, death is sacred, particularly civilian deaths. Will this be the focus of today's meeting? Will this council condemn Hamas for these crimes? Over a week ago, Israel formed a task force to establish field hospitals in southern Gaza for all those in need. This team is in touch with countries around the world, and we are already seeing progress. There is no clearer proof that that Israel is doing everything possible to provide solutions to mitigate civilian harm, while Hamas is committed to murdering both Israeli and Gazan civilians. Israel is fighting a war that it did not start or want. On October 6th, there was a ceasefire in place. Yet, Hamas violated that ceasefire with the brutal slaughter, rape, and burning of 1,400 Israelis. Despite their unbelievable claims otherwise, Hamas is fully responsible for the situation in Gaza. They are fully responsible for Gaza's civilian population. They are fully responsible for Gaza's resources, and they are fully responsible for exploiting hospitals and ambulances as weapons of terror. While Hamas must be held fully accountable, there is another body, sadly, that is complicit: the UN. Colleagues, for years, I have warned this Council of the briefings you receive, the numbers, statistics, and events that are provided to this Council by UN officials. Yes, such as Dr. Tedros, such as Mr. Lazzarini of UNRWA, such as Mr. Griffith of OCHA, from all the other libelous UN organizations, committees, and also, sadly, from the Secretary General himself. They do not reflect the situation on the ground. Yes, diplomatic niceties require us to thank them for their work, but sadly, They are relaying falsehoods that are completely detached from reality. For years, the UN has refused to establish verification mechanisms that can provide us a truthful picture of reality. WHO is it that supplies the UN with these so-called facts. Who is it that supplies the UN with these so-called facts? Is this information coming from unbiased and impartial third parties? The answer is no. Every piece of information regarding the situation on the ground that this Council receives comes from Hamas, not international UN employees in Gaza. I will remind the Council that Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, controls every facet of Gaza. Every number from the so-called Ministry of Health is Hamas. Many UNRWA workers in Gaza are themselves members of Hamas. The time has come to bust the myth of UN-supplied facts. This Council is being spoon-fed lies by the very same terrorist organization that deliberately murdered and maimed thousands of innocent Israelis just 34 days ago. Hamas has ensured that every square meter of Gaza is under their complete reign of terror. Many ambulances drivers are Hamas members. Local contributors to international media are Hamas members. We saw this week that innocent photojournalists for Reuters and the New York Times not only documented Hamas's horrors, but crossed into Israel to film them with the terrorists themselves. Hamas rules all of Gaza with an iron fist, and Hamas also rules all of the information coming out of the Strip. Just because briefings are written on official UN documents, it doesn't change the fact that the content was based on information supplied by Hamas. Hamas knows that this Council ingests their poisonous falsehoods. This is part of their script. Their very own terror operatives give libelous information, which cannot be, sadly, verified by anyone other than Hamas to UN bodies. This information is passed on to UN officials, and then this information is used to brief you. Is it not concerning to you that in Dr. Tedros' briefing, not once did he mention Hamas exploitation of hospitals and ambulances for terror? Should this not raise a red flag? We are also being briefed by the Palestinian Director General of the Red Crescent. Yet, there is no Israeli representative of Magen David Adom, the Israeli Red Cross, briefing the Council. Is this not mind-boggling? Does this not reek of bias? Do Israeli lives matter less? Are the hostages, including women, children, toddlers, and the elderly, not worthy of this Council attention? How about the trauma of tens of thousands of Israelis? Or the thousands of wounded Israelis still being treated in hospitals? Or the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who have been forced to leave their homes since the massacre? Mr. Gilani, why don't you tell the Council about the ambulances that Hamas abuses for transporting terrorists and weapons? Or is this an inconvenient truth that you choose to stay silent about? When the parking lot of El Ahli Hospital was hit by a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket, the WHO jumped on the opportunity to falsely condemn Israel. Yet, even though it has been proven beyond a fraction of a doubt that Palestinian terrorists were responsible, no effort has been made by the WHO to change the label they immediately adopted. We all remember that within minutes of the Islamic Jihad rocket attack on El Ahli Hospital, the Hamas Ministry of Health immediately reported 500 fatalities. We now know that this number was a total lie, but still UN bodies still rely on such fabrications. Stop believing Hamas falsehoods, I beg you. Last week, we were shocked to hear Dr. Michael Ryan, the executive director of the WHO Health Emergency Program, call on Gazans to remain in hospitals that serve as Hamas terror bases. By adopting Hamas narrative of evil and telling patients to remain in an active war zone, the WHO prefers to endanger the lives of Palestinians rather than save them. What is even more shocking is that Dr. Rick Peppercorn, the WHO representative for Gaza, has until today refused to be briefed by Israel. We have urged Dr. Peppercorn numerous times to speak with us about the undeniable subterranean city of terror underneath Shifa Hospital, yet we received no answer. Instead, Dr. Peppercorn and WHO prefer to parrot Hamas lies while denying to speak to any Israeli experts. WHO teams have made it clear that they prefer to reward Hamas's strategy of exploiting hospitals, and by doing so, the WHO is directly complicit in giving impunity to this despicable practice. Dear colleagues, Israel is taking action to mitigate civilian casualty. We prefer to take proactive steps because unlike Hamas and UN bodies, we cherish life and hold it sacred. This is why Israel is in advanced talks with the United Arab Emirates, with the ICRC, and with other European countries regarding the establishment of field hospitals and floating hospital ships. Israel facilitated the Jordanian airdrop of medical aid to hospitals in northern Gaza. Thousands of tons of medical equipment and supplies have already entered Gaza. Israel constantly shows that it is willing to take any step to evacuate the wounded from the war zone of northern Gaza to safer areas in the south. Sadly, Israel is doing far more for the well-being of Gazans than the WHO or any other UN body. Yet, this is not the focus of this meeting. If any UN official truly cared for Gazans, they would be working hand in hand with us to advance solutions, not condemn Israel for the measures taken to provide safety. Distinguished Council members, Hamas is supplying all of the information. I reiterate, Israeli experts are either ignored or baselessly mistrusted, and verified facts, including video, audio, and intelligence-based information, are deliberately omitted from your briefings. The words of genocidal terrorists are accepted at face value, while the irrefutable evidence of a law-abiding democracy is tossed aside. Tragically, the UN mechanisms have become terror enablers. We must no longer accept this. Colleagues, while Israel is at war with Hamas, and only with Hamas, we are also defending ourselves against murderers, numerous other terror threats. Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in Syria. These are all tentacles of the same genocidal octopus, Ayatollah regime in Iran. The Ayatollah has publicly praised the October 7th massacre, and Iran has armed, funded, and trained all of the terror groups attacking Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign minister of this murderous regime visited the UN only a week and a half ago and was given the red carpet treatment. He was loudly applauded in the General Assembly and even met with the Secretary General, who shook his hand with a big smile. The UN has completely lost its moral compass. This cannot be tolerated. Mr. President, Israel is fighting a war for her very future and existence. We are combating a genocidal Nazi-like terror organization. Hamas has publicly declared that they will carry out further atrocities if they are given the chance. The only way to ensure that these horrors are never repeated again is by eliminating Hamas capabilities. And this is the realization of our collective oath of never again. Israel will continue targeting Hamas while working towards solutions for Gazan civilians. This should be the focus of this meeting and not anything else. Thank you, Mr. President.
我现在请想发言的安理会成员 发言。下面请阿联酋代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to also thank you in leading us in a moment of silence for the lives lost in Israel and the OPT. By now, we've all heard the acronym coined by health workers in Gaza, WCNSF, which stands for Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. I just want to let that sink in as we discuss today's topic. Dr. Tedros and Dr. Jelani, I want to pay tribute to both of you, not only for making time to brief this council, but also for the life-saving work you and your teams do on the ground in very, very difficult circumstances, and your clarion call to this council today that must be heeded. Today, I also want to pay tribute to the silent heroes in the medical community in Gaza who stayed behind to deliver life-saving assistance despite these horrific circumstances. Just moments ago, many of us received messages from medical and humanitarian organizations about the heavy fighting around the Al-Shifa hospital. Medical staff tell us that they're in fear of their lives and the lives of their patients being taken, and they do not know if they will make it until the morning. Mr. President, it sometimes feels that by only dealing with the numbers from the conflict, we are indeed denying the humanity of those suffering. While it is impossible for us to go through the thousands of stories in today's meeting, I want to put a couple of faces to those numbers. Not of Hamas fighters, normal people. And Israel may be at war with Hamas, but those paying the price of this war are civilians in the thousands. Let me start with Ala Zahir Ahmed, who's in her third year of medical school. She grew up in Khan Yunis refugee camp. On the 10th of October, she was designing a poster for breast cancer awareness when the windows started shaking and everything turned black. An Israeli airstrike leveled her home, pinning her legs under the wreckage and leaving barely enough oxygen to breathe. Hours later, Ala's relatives and rescue workers pulled her from the rubble. They also recovered the lifeless bodies of her mother, her brother, and her nephew. And there are so many stories like this one. I feel the need to remind the Council that, like Ala, every single one of the 2,650 currently reported as trapped under the rubble are human beings, and that more than half of them are children. But they're not just children, they're Palestine's future, and they're also Israel's future neighbors. And we should spare no effort to protect them and save both peoples from this road of war that we are on. Born in Al-Shifa Hospital on 6th October is Talia, whose fragile heartbeat depends on a mechanical ventilator, straining generators, and dwindling fuel supply. With the strike on the hospital last night and reports of the desperate evacuations on foot as we speak here today in this council, I can't even begin to imagine what has happened to Talia, but we must not turn away from these stories. Like Talia, there are 130 other premature babies that are reliant on incubators to breathe. They are also reliant on our work here in this chamber as well as in our region. As we called for this meeting yesterday, little did we know that by the evening, a terrifying barrage of targeted attacks would be launched on schools and hospitals. Here's what that actually means. Babies, children, and the elderly who are seeking refuge and care in those facilities are also under attack. There are over 110,000 patients, including children, suffering from burns to their faces so severe that they're suffocating, with no access to antibiotics or burn cream. Women are giving birth in the most unsanitary conditions known to mankind, without medicines, and C-sections are being performed without anesthesia. The perverse reality of the situation in Gaza is that wounds inflicted by the most technologically advanced weaponry of the 21st century are being treated in conditions that are reminiscent of medieval times. To help alleviate this suffering, the UAE is establishing a field hospital in Gaza, working in solidarity with Gaza's medical personnel and in cooperation with Israel. But it's a plaster on a fracture. There can be no doubt that the attacks by Israel in pursuit of its security are disproportionate. They are cruel, and they are inhumane, and we condemn them. Also, they will not bring Israel security. So many lives are being lost without even achieving this aim. We must also not forget that those held hostage in Gaza by Hamas, many of them children, are also suffering under the same bombardment and psychological trauma, and they must be released immediately. We are witnessing the making of a lost generation of children and youth, physically and mentally scarred by these experiences. Indiscriminate attacks on civilians and civilian objects are prohibited by the laws of war. This simply cannot be part of any military strategy, defensive or otherwise. There is no state that would be condoned for conducting a military operation under those terms. Israel must end its siege of Gaza and reinstate essential services and items indispensable to human survival, including fuel, electricity, and water. Mr. President, it is not enough to simply demand humanitarian access anymore. While we must continue to call for compliance with the basic rules of international humanitarian law, as a matter of conscience, as many have said, we all know that without accountability or enforcement, this will never happen. At the bare minimum, we need to activate all the possible tools, including sustained and multi-day humanitarian pauses or truces, not least to end the suffering of children. This can also enable a humanitarian surge, the safe movement of civilian and aid workers, conditions for access to and safe release of hostages. This is fundamental for the necessary goal, a durable and sustained ceasefire. It is unconscionable that it has been 33 days of the destruction of Gaza without any Council action and response. It is time to act and to respond and help save innocent lives. And to ensure this violence ends once and for all, this two-state solution must be the overarching goal. The international community must reiterate its unwavering support for this goal. This is the only solution that takes us out of this cycle of hatred and violence and dehumanization again and again and again. Thank you, Mr. President.
谢谢。下面请美国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Director General Tedros and Director General Marwan Jalani for your briefing today and for your dedication over the past few weeks amid extraordinary challenges. At the top, let me emphasize that we are closely monitoring the situation at the hospitals in Gaza. We are deeply concerned for the well-being of civilians who are at these facilities and rely on them for life-saving care and shelter from the violence. All civilian and humanitarian facilities, especially hospitals and medical facilities, as well as the people who work for them and are engaged exclusively in medical duties, must be respected and protected consistent with international law. We know that hospitals are in desperate need of fuel. The United States has been working tirelessly to put in place mechanisms to enable the fuel to reach hospitals and to meet other urgent needs in the South. These mechanisms need to be operationalized without delay, and much more work remains to be done to meet humanitarian needs throughout Gaza. But I also want to make clear that we share Israel's concerns about Hamas's hoarding and siphoning of fuel in northern Gaza. This is unacceptable, and we must all call it out. We also must call out the fact that Hamas cynically and atrociously uses Palestinian civilians as human shields, putting its command posts, weapons, and ammunition within or beneath the very hospitals we are speaking about today, and in residential buildings, schools, mosques. Hamas does not try to protect Palestinian civilians. It deliberately and callously endangers them. At the same time, these cowardly tactics do not diminish Israel's responsibility to distinguish between civilians and terrorists in its fight against Hamas. How Israel responds to Hamas attacks matters, and Israel's response must be consistent with international humanitarian law. Rules like proportionality and precaution still apply. And the risks of harm to civilians at sites that Hamas is using for military purposes absolutely have to be considered when planning an operation. Colleagues, acknowledging one party's suffering does not negate or detract from another's. We must not look away from the pain and suffering of innocent Palestinians. More than 1.5 million Palestinians who have been displaced in the weeks since October 7th. Innocent civilians have been killed, and people are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. Palestinian families are grieving, and we grieve with them. Our capacity for empathy also requires that we mourn the Israeli civilian lives lost on October 7th. The pain and suffering of families who wait to know the fate of more than 200 civilians, women, children, the elderly, still held hostage by Hamas. Israelis are also grieving, and we too grieve with them. I want to repeat, acknowledging one party's suffering does not negate or detract from another's. That was the message Secretary Blinken delivered during his recent trip to the region, his second in the last 3 weeks. At every stop, Secretary Blinken had candid and direct conversations about Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas terrorist attacks. He underscored the need to protect civilians consistent with international humanitarian law and to surge additional humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. He emphasized U.S. support for humanitarian pauses to facilitate and expand aid delivery. And he reiterated the importance of ending this current conflict in a way that ensures lasting peace and security in the region. Colleagues, although we may have different views and positions on certain necessary steps to achieve these objectives, I think it is clear we are all committed to work toward these ends. In particular, we all agree that much more also needs to be done to make sure that humanitarian assistance reaches those in need. President Biden and Secretary Blinken have worked tirelessly over the last month with Israel, Egypt, the UN, and others to facilitate the flow of fuel, food, water, medicine, and other humanitarian supplies into Gaza. Despite these efforts, the quantity of assistance entering Gaza is nowhere near enough to meet the dire and growing needs, and we are working to urgently scale up aid deliveries. Israel has committed to implement 4-hour pauses in areas of northern Gaza each day, with an announcement to be made 3 hours beforehand. We have been told by the Israelis that there will be no military operations in these areas over the duration of the pause, and that this process is starting today. We urge that these pauses be implemented without delay, and we emphasize that coordinating these pauses with the UN would help ensure aid reaches those in need. Moreover, we continue to support calls for extended humanitarian pauses. And we are hopeful that Israel's announcement will allow for the increased flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza and will enable the safe passage of civilians seeking to flee the violence in northern Gaza. The United States will continue to lead, but it will require a collective effort from all of us to meet the soaring needs in Gaza. It is time to step up and to support the efforts of the UN. The UN is playing an essential role in the humanitarian response effort, and that work has come at great cost. Nearly 100 members of UNRWA have lost their lives. It is tragic, and thousands are putting their lives on the line every single day to help the people of Gaza. I want to underscore the United States' support for UNRWA's work and convey our condolences to those who have lost loved ones who are trying to help others, and our admiration for those who continue to carry out this vital work. We unfortunately do not yet have a way forward to secure the release of hostages, but we are working very hard on one. And if that were to take place, just being able to move hostages around the battlefield in a way that is safe will take time. And so, we believe a pause would also be appropriate in this context. Colleagues, even as we are consumed by this crisis, we must also work to chart a more peaceful future. President Biden has been very clear that we cannot go back to the way things were before October 7, either in Gaza or in the West Bank. And he has said we need to get back to the urgent work of advancing concrete progress towards a viable Palestinian state that includes both Gaza and the West Bank. The United States continues to believe the most viable path, indeed the only path, to peace is through a two-state solution. As Secretary Blinken made clear this week, the only way to ensure that this crisis never happens again is to begin setting the conditions for durable peace and security. That means there must be no forcible displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, not now and not after the war. Gaza cannot be used as a platform for terrorism or other violent attacks. There must be no reoccupation of Gaza after the conflict ends or attempt to blockade or besiege Gaza. And there must be no reduction in the territory of Gaza. Finally, we must also ensure no terrorist threats can emanate from the West Bank. Adhering to these principles and achieving a two-state outcome is the only guarantor of a secure and democratic Israel, the only guarantor of Palestinians realizing their legitimate aspirations to live in a state of their own, enjoying equal measures of security and prosperity, the only way to end this violence once and for all. Again, our capacity for empathy, our common humanity, that is what separates us from Hamas and other terrorists. We can and must acknowledge one another's suffering and keep working together to alleviate the human suffering created by this conflict. And we can and must work toward a more peaceful and secure future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Thank you, Mr. President.
谢谢。下面请巴西代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, colleagues, I thank the United Arab Emirates and China for calling for this open briefing on the health emergency in Gaza. I also thank Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus and Dr. Marwan Gilani for their briefings and commend them and their teams for their tireless work on the war-torn ground of Gaza. Brazil remains deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, marked by a disturbing increase in civilian casualties, particularly among women and children. The loss of thousands of children's lives is appalling. Children must be protected from hostilities. In President Lula's words, innocents are called upon to pay the price for the madness of war. This must stop at once. Brazil urges the Israeli authorities to exercise immediate military restraint and to respect the principles of distinction and proportionality in order to protect civilian lives and infrastructure. We also call on Hamas and all other groups to cease all indiscriminate attacks on Israeli territory. Hospitals and UN facilities have been indiscriminately attacked with an appalling number of civilian casualties, including of essential personnel such as aid workers, UN personnel, as well as journalists. Brazil calls for the protection of all medical facilities, professionals, patients, and the wounded in accordance with international humanitarian law. We also call for the safe medical evacuation of those who are seriously injured or ill. Despite the risks, UNRWA's delivery of essential emergency medical supplies from the WHO to Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City on 8 November is a step in the right direction. But we share Dr. Tedros and Mr. Lazarini's concern that it is not nearly enough to meet the overwhelming needs in Gaza. Medical supplies in Al-Shifa are critically low, and fuel shortages have become critical. We hope that the long-awaited announcement of daily humanitarian pauses in northern Gaza will facilitate the delivery of aid to civilians. As highlighted by the United Nations, the hundreds of thousands who remain in the north are facing a dire humanitarian situation as they struggle to find even minimal amounts of water and food to survive. We call for full, safe, and sustained humanitarian access to distribute essential supplies on a much larger scale, more frequently, and in greater quantities. Mr. President, besides a humanitarian ceasefire, all parties must also commit to a cessation of hostilities, which is essential for the long-term protection of all civilians. We remain deeply concerned about the fate of all hostages and call for their immediate release. Their safety, well-being, and humane treatment in accordance with international law must be guaranteed. The ICRC must be granted access to all hostages without further delay. This crisis poses a significant threat to international peace and security and has the potential to escalate into a wider conflict. 1 month into this crisis, it is clear that diplomatic efforts have failed to match the gravity of the situation. The international community must act swiftly to create the conditions for a lasting solution. Violence will not provide the answers. Yesterday in Paris, at the International Humanitarian Conference for the Civilian Population of Gaza, Brazil stressed the importance of convening a conference that can promote a political solution to this decades-old conflict with the participation of a large number of states, such as the case of the 2007 Annapolis Conference. Ignoring the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination has had an unacceptable toll of human lives and human suffering on both Palestinians and Israelis. The recognition of a viable Palestinian state living side by side with Israel within secure and mutually accepted and internationally recognized borders is the only possible solution. It is highly time we go back to this path with true political will and real diplomacy. Thank you.
谢谢巴西代表，下面请加蓬代表发言。
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma délégation remercie le directeur général de l'OMS pour son témoignage et pour toutes les informations mises à notre disposition. Nous avons suivi avec attention l'intervention du directeur général du Croissant Rouge palestinien sur la situation bouleversante des populations de Gaza. Voilà 35 jours que nous assistons à une escalade terrifiante des violences, dont les premières victimes sont les enfants. D'abord sur le sol israélien, avec les attaques barbares du Hamas du 7 octobre, puis à Gaza, où depuis plus d'1 mois, plus personne n'est en sécurité nulle part, mais également en Cisjordanie occupée. La mise en œuvre de la résolution adoptée le 26 octobre dernier par l'Assemblée générale de l'ONU revêt de ce fait un caractère urgent. L'impasse dans laquelle se trouve le Conseil de sécurité défie à ce jour toute logique et tout sens. Il est temps de trouver une solution pour que cesse ce chaos. Il est impératif que notre Conseil de sécurité surmonte les entraves politiques et géopolitiques. Mon pays en appelle à l'humanité de tous. Nous espérons sincèrement qu'un consensus pourra être trouvé rapidement afin que le Conseil de sécurité puisse être à la hauteur de son mandat. Le Gabon réitère sa ferme condamnation de toutes les violences meurtrières indiscriminées et est profondément choqué par la multiplicité des frappes contre les écoles, les hôpitaux, les ambulances, ainsi que les camps de réfugiés. L'attaque mardi contre le convoi du CICR, alors qu'il se rendait pour livrer des fournitures médicales vitales aux hôpitaux de Gaza, est inadmissible. Ces violations flagrantes du droit international et du droit international humanitaire sont injustifiées, inacceptables et doivent de ce fait cesser. Dans le même élan, toutes les privations en produits essentiels, denrées alimentaires, eau, électricité, carburant et médicaments ne peuvent perdurer. Un accès sans entrave, sûr et durable de l'acheminement et de la distribution des biens et services essentiels pour les millions de populations dont le besoin est primordial. Nous prenons note, avec intérêt, de la décision des autorités israéliennes de mettre en place des pauses quotidiennes dans le nord de la bande de Gaza. Nous reconnaissons les efforts des États-Unis, du Qatar, ainsi que de l'Égypte. Monsieur le Président, le Gabon tient à réaffirmer que la cessation des hostilités est la seule solution à cette crise humanitaire galopante. Seule une cessation des hostilités pourrait assurer la protection de toutes les populations civiles de Gaza, y compris des otages israéliens qui y sont détenus et qui doivent être libérés sans condition. Ce n'est qu'en faisant taire les armes que les opérations de sauvetage des enfants, notamment ceux piégés sous les décombres, pourrait s'effectuer. Ce n'est qu'en faisant taire les armes que les acteurs humanitaires pourraient identifier et organiser la prise en charge provisoire des enfants non accompagnés qui ont été séparés de leurs parents ou qui sont devenus orphelins. À cet égard, nous rappelons le rôle crucial des pays exerçant une influence sur les parties impliquées. Nous saluons les initiatives louables déjà entreprises par tous ces pays pour atténuer l'impact humanitaire du conflit, à l'instar de la conférence humanitaire internationale qui s'est tenue le 9 novembre à Paris, ou le sommet de l'OCI prévu le 12 novembre à Riyad, auquel prendra part le Gabon. Nous encourageons vivement ces pays ayant une influence sur les parties à redoubler d'efforts pour favoriser la désescalade et la recherche d'une solution pacifique. La paix et la stabilité du Moyen-Orient sont des objectifs que nous devons tous poursuivre sans relâche. Enfin, Monsieur le Président, les causes profondes de ce conflit qui ont miné pendant des années les relations entre les peuples palestiniens et israéliens ne peuvent être dissociées de la situation actuelle. Je réitère l'attachement du Gabon à la solution à deux États coexistant de manière pacifique sur la base des frontières internationalement reconnues. Pour terminer, mon pays réaffirme sa conviction que la diplomatie, le dialogue et la négociation sont les canaux incontournables pour parvenir à une solution durable à ce conflit. Solution qui ferait prévaloir le droit du peuple palestinien à l'autodétermination et le droit légitime d'Israël à la sécurité. Nous réitérons notre appui au secrétaire général Antonio Guterres et à toutes ces initiatives. Je vous remercie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour l'organisation de cette réunion ouverte, mais aussi pour le moment de silence que nous avons pu dédier à toutes et tous les victimes. Je souhaite également remercier le directeur général de l'OMS, Dr Ghebreyesus, et M. Marwan Jilani, directeur général du Crescent rouge palestinien, de leur travail dans les circonstances les plus difficiles et de leur présentation qui rendent compte de l'extrême gravité de la situation actuelle. La Suisse est profondément préoccupée par l'impact du conflit sur les civils, femmes, hommes et enfants, et sur les infrastructures civiles dans la bande de Gaza. Les civils ont un besoin urgent de protection et d'assistance. La situation sanitaire continue de se dégrader très rapidement pour la population civile, dont le 1,5 million de personnes déplacées qui se trouvent depuis plus d'un mois complètement assiégées, privées d'eau, d'électricité et de services essentiels à leur survie. Le droit international humanitaire protège la population civile et les biens à caractère civil. Il doit être respecté à tout moment par tout le monde, en particulier les principes de distinction, de proportionnalité et de précaution dans la conduite des hostilités. La mission médicale, dont les transports médicaux, les hôpitaux, les cliniques et les personnes qui y sont soignées, ainsi que le personnel médical qui y travaille, jouit d'une protection spécifique en vertu du droit international. Elle ne doit jamais être prise pour cible. Un convoi humanitaire du CICR transportant du matériel d'aide d'urgence à destination de l'hôpital Al-Quds a essuyé des tirs mardi passé. Cet incident, et nous en avons entendu d'autres, illustre l'environnement dans lequel les organisations humanitaires, impartiales et parées d'un emblème universellement reconnu, doivent opérer à Gaza. Je rends hommage aux dizaines de collaborateurs comme ceux de l'UNRWA ou du Crescent rouge qui ont perdu la vie dans l'exercice de leurs fonctions. Nous notons également avec la plus grande inquiétude les dégâts réguliers sur les hôpitaux, tels que l'hôpital pour enfants An-Nasser. Le volume d'aide est insuffisant. En raison du manque de carburant, plusieurs hôpitaux et cliniques ont dû cesser de fonctionner. Il est essentiel que l'eau, la nourriture, les fournitures médicales ainsi que le carburant puissent entrer. Par ailleurs, l'aide doit aussi parvenir aux centaines de milliers de civils se trouvant dans le nord de Gaza. La présidente du CICR a souligné hier, à l'occasion de la conférence de Paris, je cite, « L'impératif immédiat est de sauver des vies et de préserver l'humanité. Un accès rapide et durable à l'aide humanitaire et à l'approvisionnement est désespérément nécessaire. » Nous remercions la France pour l'organisation de cette conférence. La Suisse prévoit de fournir une aide humanitaire d'urgence supplémentaire à hauteur de 90 millions de francs dans toute la région. Aussi, la Suisse continuera de travailler au sein de ce Conseil à la mise en place de mesures urgentes telles que des pauses ou trêves humanitaires nécessaires pour garantir un accès sûr, rapide et sans entrave à l'assistance humanitaire. Monsieur le Président, la Suisse a condamné, dès le 7 octobre dernier, et avec la plus grande fermeté, les actes de terreur et toutes les attaques indiscriminées perpétrées par le Hamas contre les populations civiles en Israël. La Suisse demande la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle des personnes prises en otage et actuellement détenues à Gaza. En même temps qu'elle reconnaît le droit d'Israël d'assurer sa défense et sa sécurité, la Suisse rappelle que la protection des civils et le respect du droit international humanitaire sont obligatoires. Le respect du droit international humanitaire doit rester une priorité de ce Conseil. Par ailleurs, la Suisse reste très préoccupée par la forte hausse de la violence en Cisjordanie occupée. Face à l'augmentation de la violence des colons, la Suisse rappelle les obligations d'Israël en vertu du droit international, y compris l'obligation de protéger la population civile. Il est nécessaire que des enquêtes soient menées sur toutes les violations du droit international en Israël et dans l'ensemble du territoire palestinien occupé afin que leurs auteurs soient traduits en justice. Enfin, ne perdons jamais de vue que le seul socle sur lequel la paix et la stabilité peuvent reposer est la solution à deux États démocratiques, Israël et la Palestine, qui vivent côte à côte en paix à l'intérieur de frontières sûres et reconnues. Et c'est pour cela que nous devons toutes et tous, ensemble, nous engager. Je vous remercie.
我感谢瑞士代表的发言，下面请法国代表发言。
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie le directeur général de l'OMS et Monsieur Marwan Gilani de leurs exposés. Les attaques terroristes du Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes contre Israël le 7 octobre dernier doivent être unanimement condamnées et tous les otages doivent être libérés immédiatement et sans condition. Chaque vie compte et il n'y a pas de poids de mesure. Israël a le droit de se défendre et le devoir de le faire dans le respect du droit international humanitaire, donc en préservant les populations civiles. Monsieur le Président, les civils palestiniens perdent la vie chaque jour à Gaza. Les enfants palestiniens perdent la vie chaque jour à Gaza. Et nous l'avons entendu, ils sont aussi exposés aux pires conditions sanitaires qui soient et à un risque élevé d'épidémie. La France remercie l'OMS pour l'action de ses équipes sur le terrain. Elle salue aussi l'engagement du secrétaire général des Nations Unies et le travail des agences de l'ONU et des acteurs humanitaires sur le terrain. Et nous adressons nos sincères condoléances aux Nations Unies après le décès de 100 personnels de l'UNRWA. La situation humanitaire est catastrophique et nous devons agir. Pour cela, la France continuera d'appeler à une trêve humanitaire immédiate, durable, soutenue, devant pouvoir mener un cessez-le-feu auquel nous devons tous œuvrer. Un accès humanitaire sans entrave et durable à la bande de Gaza doit être assuré de toute urgence. Tous les points de passage doivent être ouverts et le nombre de convois doit être à la hauteur des besoins. Les infrastructures civiles, les hôpitaux doivent être protégés dans le respect du droit international humanitaire. Et il faut également permettre un rétablissement immédiat des services de base, et notamment pour garantir l'accès à l'eau, à l'assainissement, à l'électricité. La conférence internationale humanitaire de soutien à la population civile à Gaza, qui a été organisée à Paris hier à l'initiative du président de la République, M. Macron, a permis de comptabiliser plus d'1 milliard d'euros de contributions financières. L'aide de la France a été portée à 100 millions d'euros pour les populations civiles palestiniennes. Et nous avons également acheminé 87 tonnes de frais humanitaires au cours des derniers jours. 30 tonnes supplémentaires le seront dans les prochains jours dans le cadre du pont aérien de l'Union européenne. Monsieur le Président, les violences perpétrées par des colons israéliens à l'encontre de la population palestinienne qui se multiplient en Cisjordanie et contraignent les populations palestiniennes à fuir sont inacceptables. Et la France réitère sa demande aux autorités israéliennes de les faire cesser. Nous avons aussi le devoir d'empêcher un embrasement de l'ensemble de la région. Et nous appelons à assurer la sécurité des casques bleus, de la FINUL, de la FNUOD, de l'ONU-SCT, qui continuent à assurer leur mandat. La France est pleinement engagée pour éviter une extension de ce conflit à la région. Et nous condamnons par ailleurs les tirs houthis en direction d'Israël. Le monde ne peut plus ignorer l'aspiration légitime des Palestiniens et des Israéliens à vivre en paix et en sécurité. Nous connaissons tous les conditions de cette paix durable. Ce sont des garanties indispensables à apporter à Israël pour sa sécurité et un État pour les Palestiniens. Il faut restaurer un horizon politique. La seule solution viable est une solution à deux États. Et cet impératif ne peut plus être seulement une perspective, il doit devenir une réalité. La France poursuivra son engagement constructif au sein de ce Conseil pour que celui-ci adopte une résolution au plus vite. Nous le devons aux Israéliens et aux Palestiniens. Je vous remercie.
感谢法国代表的发言，下面请日本代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank WHO Director General Dr. Tedros and Mr. Giuliani for your detailed description of the situation and personal stories with fear, pain, and loss. And I thank you and your team's dedication under this unimaginable situation. Mr. President, the situation in Gaza grows more desperate by the day, and time is of the essence. We greatly admire the humanitarian workers continue to work in incredibly dangerous conditions, and we lament the death of more than 100 UNRWA staff. Regrettably, the Security Council has remained silent for more than a month since the conflict broke out with the horrifying acts of terror by Hamas in Israel on 7th of October. The time of concrete action is now. To this end, Japan fully supports humanitarian pauses as well as humanitarian corridors to facilitate urgently needed assistance, civilian movement, and release of hostages. Full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access should be granted without delay and in a continuous manner. We welcome the tireless diplomacy by the international community, including the International Conference on Humanitarian Aid for Gaza held in Paris yesterday. Japan hopes that pauses announced by the US government on 9th November will contribute to enhanced delivery of life-saving humanitarian aid, protection of civilians, and release of hostages in Gaza. On our part, Japan, as the G7 presidency, hosted the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Tokyo this week, calling for urgent action to address the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The recently announced flash appeal requires $1.2 billion to meet immediate humanitarian needs in Gaza and the West Bank. Japan has been playing its part. Our foreign minister has recently announced that Japan is prepared to provide an additional humanitarian aid package of $65 million and emergency relief supplies through JICA, Japan's aid agency, in addition to the already decided emergency grant aid worth $10 million. We call on all member states and humanitarian partners to join this effort to alleviate the suffering of the people in Gaza. Mr. President, over 200 hostages, including many children, are still held by Hamas and other militants in Gaza. Hostage-taking goes against the fundamental principles of international law, and we unequivocally condemn it. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages. Their loved ones are waiting with increasing despair. The risk of regional spillover is very real. The situation in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen are getting worrisome. Additionally, the rise in extremist settler violence committed against Palestinians is totally unacceptable, undermines security in the West Bank, and threatens prospects of a lasting peace. A single miscalculation of any of these fronts could lead to a disastrous regional conflict, and we must do all we can to stop this. This conflict has to end, and relevant parties need to return to negotiations towards finally achieving a two-state solution where both Israel and a viable Palestinian state live side by side in peace and security. In the short term, we should take all possible measures to bring about an early de-escalation of the conflict as a first step towards a durable peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
感 谢日本代表的发言，下面请英国代表发言。
Thank you, President, both for organising this session and our moment of silence earlier. I'd also like to thank Dr. Tedros and Dr. Gilani, not just for your briefings, but for the life-saving work that you and your teams are doing. Colleagues, we're in no doubt. There is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And as Dr. Tedros set out, that humanitarian crisis is deteriorating day by day. Of course, we welcome the opening of the Rafah border, and we thank partners for their work in allowing foreign nationals to leave. But it is essential and urgent that more aid flows in the other direction, into Gaza. Access, both through Rafah and other crossing points, needs to improve so that aid can reach the people who so desperately need it. For this to happen, we must see humanitarian pauses that allow enough time for aid to be delivered to those who need it, and for hostages to be released. Fuel must be allowed to enter Gaza so that hospitals and water desalination plants can operate and for aid to be delivered. The pauses in northern Gaza are a first step, but any pauses in hostilities should allow sufficient time and security, both for civilians to move and for humanitarian aid to be delivered. Since the 7th of October, the UK has been firm in its support for Israel's right to self-defense following Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel. In this context, international humanitarian law is not a nice to have. International humanitarian law is what keeps humanitarian workers and medical staff safe to assist those in need and protects civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, wherever possible. So we urge all parties to the conflict to take all possible steps to minimize harm to civilians, health and humanitarian workers, and to protected sites. And we express our condolences for each life lost. Finally, Mr. President, we have been clear that Israel must do more to prevent escalation in the West Bank. We welcome statements, including that made by Prime Minister Netanyahu, condemning settler violence. But we must see tangible action to bring perpetrators to justice. We also condemn attacks against Israel emanating from armed groups in the region. The UK Foreign Secretary was in Riyadh yesterday, where he discussed preventing regional escalation with the foreign ministers and representatives of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Lebanon, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and the Palestinian Authority. The Foreign Secretary also reaffirmed the UK's unwavering commitment to a two-state solution. Thank you, President.
我感谢英国代表的发言，下面请加纳代表发言。
Mr. President, let me begin by thanking Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus and Dr. Marwan Gilani for their insightful but sobering briefings to the Council on the medical systems and situation in Gaza. As we have followed closely the unfolding events that have provoked this meeting, we continue to be distressed by the situation in the Middle East, and especially in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank. The reported high number of children killed in the present conflict, as well as the continued holding of many as hostages, is deeply distressing. Besides the many deaths on both sides, 101 UNRWA staff have also been killed since the start of the war, which according to the United Nations is on record as the highest number in any conflict. The high intensity of casualties in the ongoing conflict should compel urgent action on the part of this Council to act to prevent the further death of civilians and humanitarian workers. Not unlike many other conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere, the inability of this Council to reach a consensus on how to get the parties to end the hostilities has affected the ability to effectively undertake the delivery of humanitarian assistance, protect civilians, and ensure adherence to international law. We therefore hope that the Council can unite around a common approach to abate the hostilities and bring the warring parties to a peaceful resolution of the month-old war. Ghana notes the intention to allow a daily 4-hour humanitarian pause in the fighting in northern Gaza to be announced 3 hours before the pause begins each day. We believe more can be done and more should be done. We must also create urgent conditions for safe humanitarian corridors, for rescue and recovery operations, and safe passage for the wounded, sick children, pregnant women, and caregivers in conformity with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, war, no matter the cause and its circumstances, must be done in compliance with international law. Civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and their personnel and medical systems, should be avoided as part of this conflict, either as shields by Hamas militants or as legitimate targets in attacking them. Water and fuel must be supplied and not hindered. We reiterate our call on countries that have a moderating influence over the parties to intensify efforts aimed at stopping the fighting and securing the release of all Israeli and foreign captives. We reiterate our call on the Hamas militia to heed the demand of the international community for the immediate and unconditional release of all captured civilians. Holding innocent civilian populations as captives is wrong and unacceptable, regardless of the motives. Mr. President, the economic cost of not acting to stop the war should not also be lost on us. We are concerned by an assessment released by the UNDP and ESQA, which states that at least 45% of all housing in the Gaza Strip have been damaged or destroyed by the bombardments. A month into the war against Hamas and Israel's near siege of Gaza, the gross domestic product in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip has shrunk by 4%, sending over 400,000 people into poverty, an economic impact unseen in the conflicts in Syria and Ukraine or any previous Israeli-Hamas conflict. The consequences of the economic devastation on top of the destruction of infrastructure, including the medical systems, could be great unless we act now. In conclusion, Mr. President, we must all be guided by the dire situation on the ground and by the desire of the international community to end the ongoing war, which has resulted in close to 12,000 human casualties on both sides and brought immense suffering to children who constitute over 40% of the fatalities, women and the aged who are the most vulnerable in Gaza. Our conduct and deliberations must reflect the expectations to help the parties to end their ongoing hostilities. We began this meeting with a minute's silence. That observance should galvanize us to silence the sound of guns, rockets, and missiles that have dominated over the lands of Israel and Palestine in the past month. I thank you.
我感谢加纳代表的发言，下面请阿尔巴尼亚代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me also thank WHO Director General Ghebreyesus and Mr. Gilani for their briefing. We are grateful to them and to everyone working on the ground to deliver life-saving assistance to those in need. Mr. President, the traumatizing developments of the last 4 weeks have shattered the Israeli and Palestinian lives, have brought the region to the brink of a major catastrophe, while the ongoing dramatic developments remain utterly troubling. Hamas continues to ignore the call of the international community and of the United Nations to unconditionally release hostages, which it is holding illegally and without justification. It continues to throw its rockets indiscriminately on Israel, and its leaders rejoice of their massacres and keep repeating that they will do it over and over again. 1 million times, said publicly one of them. Albania stands firm with Israel in its legitimate right to self-defense against pure savagery, but in a proportionate manner and profoundly rooted in the law, and supports its and all efforts for the release of hostages. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Gaza needs no description. Despite some efforts and improved access deemed insufficient, the current situation is not sustainable. More than 800 trucks have crossed Gaza through the Rafah crossing, but much more is needed and much more should be done. Hospitals should be provided with critical supplies and must remain protected. Further, concrete, improved and urgent actions are needed. Food, water, medical supplies and fuel must be delivered. They should not go to Hamas and their fighters, but they cannot be denied to civilians. We have said it many times and want to repeat it again. Every response to Hamas and their fighting capabilities should be carefully and properly targeted and made with distinction and precaution. Civilians are not responsible for Hamas actions. They do not have to pay for the actions of terrorists and extremists. Civilians and the infrastructure they rely on, including hospitals, shelters and schools, must be protected. They cannot be used for other purposes and cannot be places where Hamas can hide or from where they can operate. Mr. President, while we understand that a terrorist organization should not be allowed to reorganize, regroup, ambush, or continue to kill, as they have shown what they are able to do, while there is fierce fighting against barbarism, there is need to keep and show the best of humanity. While there can be no equation whatsoever between the massacres of Hamas and the military actions of the Israeli army, we need to make sure that protection of civilians and the international humanitarian law do not remain just empty words, but serious commitments to be observed and respected, and which call for prompt and serious actions. The staggering losses in innocent human lives among Palestinians and the unbearable number of children killed are profoundly disturbing. Far too many innocent people are dying for nothing, caught in a war that is not theirs. This war against terror should not unduly punish those it means to save, those it needs to save. We welcome the 4-hour daily pauses and the safe passage corridors as a concrete step in the right direction. They need to be fully coordinated with the UN actors and their partners on the ground so that protection of civilians and humanitarian help becomes truly effective. We hear the UN humanitarian workers and their partners on the ground argue that this may not be enough. They must be heard. Mr. President, we praise and welcome all efforts made, in particular by the United States, to avoid the spillover of the conflict in the region. Whoever seeks to use the current situation to advance their goals and bring more conflict, more misery, more victims and chaos in the wider region should think twice. The well-known troublemakers and supporters of terror in the region, those who applaud, support, and finance Hamas terror, and other cynical supporters of them should be held in check. But there is need for more. As soon as hostilities are over, Gaza, free of Hamas, should emerge with a renewed administration and political organization. It should be rebuilt through a collective solidarity effort. It is therefore urgent to do the utmost to revive the political horizon with a serious offer and plan for the two-state solution as the only viable prospect in a future region free of terror. Children of Gaza should not grow to become future fighters, but good citizens. They should not be raised with hate, but with tolerance and respect for others. They should be taught citizenship education, not propaganda and bigotry. This is an arduous and long road. It will require genuine and sustained efforts. but it may never happen if parties do not agree to get together with the strong help of the international community and design a path to peace, one that provides the Israelis with what they need, security and peace, and the Palestinians with what they want and deserve, their own state and freedom. If not, real and lasting change will not happen in the Middle East, and any appeasement will only delay in time the next confrontation. I thank you.
谢谢。下面请厄瓜多尔代表发言。
Señor presidente, agradezco al director general de la Organización Mundial de la Salud y al director general de la Media Luna Roja Palestina por sus oportunos informes de esta tarde y que nos recuerdan el sombrío panorama al que nos enfrenta este conflicto. Deseo reconocer y valorar la heroica tarea del personal sanitario que en estos mismos momentos arriesga su vida por salvar a otras personas en condiciones inimaginables para quienes estamos aquí cómodamente sentados en Nueva York, como recordaba el director de la OMS, haciendo referencia a su experiencia personal. Mi homenaje también para el personal sanitario que ya ha perdido su vida en este conflicto y mis condolencias a sus familias. Señor presidente, todo conflicto armado conlleva graves consecuencias para la salud de la población afectada, tanto por el efecto directo de las armas utilizadas como por el deterioro de las condiciones de salubridad causado por la destrucción del entorno y la suspensión de servicios básicos. La explosión de violencia registrada en la zona de conflicto desde el ataque terrorista perpetrado por Hamas el 7 de octubre es la más grave en décadas y, consecuentemente, sus consecuencias humanitarias son también de gran magnitud. Condenamos enérgicamente el uso de civiles como escudos humanos por parte de Hamas y el lanzamiento indiscriminado de cohetes. Asimismo, reiteramos nuestra condena ante la muerte de civiles en Gaza debido a bombardeos como los ocurridos en las cercanías del hospital Al-Shifa en días pasados, así como todos los centros de salud, como nos ha sido informado en esta tarde. Nos solidarizamos con las familias de las víctimas. La infraestructura civil, incluyendo la sanitaria, no debe ser jamás un objetivo. El Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja señala que las unidades sanitarias, como hospitales y otras infraestructuras creadas con fines de atención médica, deben ser respetadas y protegidas en todas las circunstancias. Las unidades sanitarias no pueden ser objeto de ataque ni se podrá limitar el acceso a ellas. Las partes en un conflicto armado deben adoptar medidas para proteger las unidades sanitarias contra ataques, por ejemplo, cerciorándose de que no estén ubicadas en la proximidad de objetivos militares. El personal sanitario también debe ser respetado y protegido en toda circunstancia. Las disposiciones del derecho internacional humanitario deben ser respetadas en todo momento y por todos. No son de acatamiento voluntario y su incumplimiento conlleva graves responsabilidades. Esto incluye también la obligación de liberar a los rehenes inmediata e incondicionalmente. Asimismo, la ayuda humanitaria, incluyendo medicamentos, energía, agua, alimentos e insumos médicos, debe llegar a quienes lo necesitan en la cantidad y con la oportunidad necesarias. Para el efecto, resulta ineludible una tregua humanitaria inmediata, duradera y respetada. Es imposible abastecer hospitales o distribuir ayuda humanitaria mientras siguen las hostilidades. Valoramos todo esfuerzo para proteger a los civiles y evitar mayor sufrimiento. Iniciativas como la Conferencia Internacional Humanitaria para Gaza, celebrada ayer en París, son encomiables. Sin embargo, estos esfuerzos por sí solos no son suficientes. Todos tenemos una responsabilidad individual y colectiva. La debemos ejercer de buena fe. Es urgente que quienes tienen el poder de veto lleguen a acuerdos que le permitan actuar a este Consejo. Señor Presidente, finalizo esta intervención reiterando un encarecido llamado a evitar que la violencia se contagie a otras zonas y aleje aún más el prospecto de una solución pacífica, justa y definitiva a este conflicto. Debemos agotar nuestros esfuerzos para contribuir a este objetivo. Muchas gracias.
谢谢。下面请俄罗斯代表发言。
Господин председатель, всецело поддерживаем востребованность созыва делегации Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов в срочном заседании Совета Безопасности по гуманитарной ситуации в секторе Газа. Благодарим генерального директора Всемирной организации здравоохранения доктора Тедроса Адханома и генерального директора Палестинского общества Красного полумесяца Марвана Джилани за брифинги о положении дел в палестинском анклаве. Высоко ценим самоотверженную работу представителей ВОС и всех коллег-гуманитарщиков на земле в крайне опасных условиях. Предоставленная сегодняшними докладчиками информация о катастрофических масштабах гуманитарного кризиса в секторе Газа не может не шокировать. В палестинском анклаве разворачивается настоящая гуманитарная катастрофа, трагедия всемирного масштаба. Ударами израильской авиации полностью разрушена или повреждена почти половина жилых домов и жизненно важных объектов гражданской инфраструктуры. За последние сутки 4 палестинские больницы подвергались бомбардировкам. Полностью прекратили работу 18 из 35 больниц сектора. 35 тысяч строений уничтожены. Еще 165 тысяч получили повреждения. В списке разрушенных или поврежденных зданий числится 221 школа, 42 объекта БАПОР, 7 церквей и 56 мечетей. Руководство ОПОР сообщает, что жертвами бомбардировок стали уже 101 сотрудник агентства. Шокированы и глубоко возмущены тем, что целями ударов становятся гражданские объекты, школы, больницы, мечети, лагеря беженцев. Акцентируем, что целенаправленные удары по гражданским объектам – это вопиющее нарушение международного гуманитарного права. А соблюдение международного гуманитарного права – это императив. У любой войны есть правила, и любые насильственные действия в отношении мирных жителей, нанесение ударов по жилой застройке и объектам гражданской инфраструктуры категорически неприемлемы. По имеющимся данным, только сегодня утром ударом подверглись больницы Аль-Кудс, Аль-Шифа, а также мечети Халеда бин Аль-Валида и Аль-Ихлас. Причем эти мечети расположены в южной части сектора Газа, что подтверждает информацию о том, что безопасных для гражданских зон сегодня в секторе попросту не существует. Сектор подвергается жестокой тотальной блокаде, от которой в первую очередь страдает гражданское население. В Газе остро не хватает медикаментов, продовольствия и топлива. В больницах не хватает мест. Дефицит чистой воды создает угрозу резкого ухудшения санитарно-эпидемиологической обстановки. Помощь жителям осажденного анклава поступает по линии многих государств и организаций. Российская сторона также оказывает гуманитарную поддержку населению сектора Газа. Так, сегодня, 10 ноября, Эмирком России сообщил, что направит самолетом в Египет уже 4-ю партию продовольствия и медикаментов 25 тонн. Тем не менее, как мы сегодня услышали от доктора Тедроса Адханома и Марвана Джилани, несмотря на проходы в северную часть анклава гуманитарных конвоев, этого явно недостаточно для удовлетворения колоссальных потребностей сектора Газа. Если не будут предприняты кардинальные шаги по деэскалации конфликта, его последствия будут ощущаться неизвестно как долго. Господин председатель, в тени трагических событий в Газе незаслуженно оказалась забытой взрывоопасная ситуация на западном берегу реки Иордан. Между тем, с 7 октября во всех крупных городах СБРИ наблюдается резкая эскалация насилия в результате операций израильских силовиков и насильственных акций поселенцев в отношении палестинского населения. Вне зависимости от того, что творится в секторе Газа, ситуация на СБРИ сама по себе заслуживает пристального внимания нашего Совета. В столкновении с подразделениями Цахал за прошедший месяц погибло 148 палестинцев. Для сравнения, за весь 2022 год по ООНовским данным 155. Более 2,2 тысяч человек получили ранения, еще более 2000 задержаны. Армией практикуются и коллективные наказания, наиболее частыми из которых является полная блокада населенных пунктов путем перекрытия всех ведущих в него дорог из соображений безопасности. В настоящее время заблокирован доступ палестинского населения ко многим крупным транспортным артериям на СБРИ, что наносит существенный ущерб местной экономике. Планомерно продолжаются сносы палестинских домов, не имеющих израильского разрешения строительства, получить которое для местных палестинцев практически нереально. По данным УКГВ, с начала эскалации конфликта гуманитарщики ежедневно фиксируют многочисленные акты насилия со стороны израильских поселенцев. Кроме того, за октябрь этого года из-за угроз поселенцев почти 2000 палестинцев были вынуждены покинуть свои дома. Наиболее легкой и частой мишенью являются относительно изолированные бедуинские общины. Обращение в израильскую полицию и армию предсказуемо оказывается безрезультатным. Напротив, зачастую силовики оказывают прямую поддержку поселенцам во время противоправных акций или, как минимум, не вмешиваются в происходящее. Отмечаемые акты насилия в отношении израильтян и правозащитников, которые не боятся назвать происходящее в Газе своими именами. Господин председатель, вновь подчеркиваем недопустимость и опасность эскалации конфликта. Убеждены, что первым шагом в этом направлении стало бы скорейшее прекращение огня в зоне палестино-израильского конфликта. Только это, а не некие кратковременные паузы, является единственной реальной мерой, которая позволила бы избежать новых жертв, обеспечить оказание необходимой гуманитарной помощи нуждающимся, содействие населению Газы и поставила бы заслон на пути дальнейшего разрастания вооруженной конфронтации и втягивания в нее новых региональных участников. Риски регионального и глобального противостояния в регионе с огромным количеством исторически нерешенных вопросов, конфликтных проблем и потенциальных рисков очевидны. Но палестино-израильский конфликт является ключевой проблемой, без решения которой невозможно надеяться на прочный мир на Ближнем Востоке. Все последние годы мы говорили, в том числе в ходе ежемесячных заседаний Совета Безопасности по ближневосточному регулированию, о том, что придание забвению всей международно-правовой базы урегулирования палестино-израильского конфликта приведет к эскалации. И тогда уже всему миру придется заниматься его разрешением. Господин председатель, решение палестинского вопроса ни в коем случае не должно быть связано с попытками выдавить палестинцев из мест их исконного проживания. Необходимо настоящее, глубинное, фундаментальное решение этой застарелой исторической проблемы именно с опорой на положение международного права. Как убедительно доказывает история, попытки монополизировать посреднические функции приводят не к урегулированию конфликтов, а к их обострению, свидетелями чего мы как раз сейчас и являемся. Блокирование Вашингтоном мирных инициатив о прекращении огня в секторе Газа на данном этапе и его однобокая линия на протяжении последних лет, направленная на сохранение, как они сами сформулировали, статус-кво, и его так называемая тихая дипломатия, были на самом деле нежеланием реализовывать все, о чем договаривались страны и народы. Отсутствие какого-либо прогресса на переговорном треке не могло не привести к радикализации и взрыву. Еще раз скажем, это в свою очередь может спровоцировать расширение географии конфликта и активизацию других потенциальных или тлеющих конфликтов в регионе. Неоднократно говорили о том, что наращивание иностранного военного присутствия в зоне вооруженного конфликта, в частности, американской группировки в Восточном Средиземноморье и провокационные воинственные заявления тоже являются частью глобальной эскалации, что лишь может усугубить ситуацию. Убеждены, что без урегулирования палестинской проблемы на всем хорошо известной международной правовой основе говорить о долгосрочной стабилизации в регионе Ближнего Востока не приходится. Без этого не станет безопаснее и Израилю. Сегодня же, как никогда, важно немедленно решить задачу прекращения кровопролития, избегать односторонних действий, включая поселенческое поглощение районов западного берега реки Иордан, попрание святыни Иерусалима, подстрекательство к насилию и терроризму. Особенно востребованным в сложившихся обстоятельствах видится обеспечение межпалестинского единства. Мы также всецело поддерживаем все настойчиво звучащие сейчас призывы к коллективным действиям влиятельных международных игроков. Хотели бы также акцентировать центральную роль государств Ближнего Востока в решении проблем региона. Нельзя позволить сторонним силам эксплуатировать палестино-израильскую конфронтацию для слома позитивных тенденций последнего времени по нормализации в регионе Ближнего Востока. Вовлеченность и единство расположенных там государств и всех заинтересованных сторон вокруг одобренной решениями Совета Безопасности ООН международно-правовой основы урегулирования вкупе с политической волей палестинцев и израильтян к переговорам по комплексу вопросов окончательного статуса ключевая предпосылка к перезапуску всеобъемлющего мирного процесса на Ближнем Востоке. Благодарю вас.
谢谢。下面我请莫桑比克代表发言。
Mr. President, Mozambique wishes to thank China, President of the Security Council, for convening this important meeting. We extend our profound gratitude to Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, Director General of the World Health Organization, for the valuable and moving testimony provided us on the health and humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. Yours is a moral voice that we have to listen to. We also thank Mr. Marwan Jilani for his comprehensive briefing. Mr. President, it is with heart broken that we follow the daily reports of incessant attacks on civilians, children, women, men, and aid workers and health workers, as well as the destruction of hospitals, schools, and other civilian infrastructures in Gaza. This is a horrifying situation that completely ignores the human cost of this crisis and that should be strongly condemned. The depriving of food, medicines, water, and electricity to a trapped civilian population as a result of military action compounds the gravity of the tragic humanitarian situation that worsens by the day. It is our belief that this monstrous calamity will further alienate the Palestinian people for generations to come. and undermine efforts towards achieving reconciliation, peace, and stability in the region. We therefore reiterate our call for a full compliance with all international human rights law and international humanitarian law that include norms and rules for the protection of civilians and humanitarian assistance. An immediate ceasefire will, in our view, halt and minimize civilian deaths and the destruction of infrastructure. It will also ensure that aid could be delivered to Gaza and ensure that millions of innocent civilians in need could benefit from humanitarian assistance. As members of the United Nations, we embrace and fully abide by inherent right of individual or collective self-defense against other states or non-state actors envisaged by Article 51 of the Charter. But that right must be exercised in accordance with the same Charter, and I quote, shall not in any way affect the authority and responsibility of the Security Council, end of quote. So we are in agreement with those who claim that it is time for the Council to act. We therefore call for immediate and decisive steps to be taken to de-escalate the situation and to ensure sustained and unhindered access and safe delivery of life-saving aid. It is our collective duty to ensure the protection of all civilians, both in Israel and Gaza, who are the innocent and unjustified target of the conflict between the IDF and Hamas. We have unequivocally condemned the massacre of 7th October by Hamas. As a liberation movement for our own freedom and independence, our people have never resorted in their struggle to mass killing of innocent people, even those serving the oppressing machinery of colonialists. On the other hand, our people have had an unforgettable experience of being victim of mass killings, massacres, and incidences of crimes against humanity. First, in our condition as a colony, and then as a victim of aggression from the illegal regime in South Rhodesia, and later from the South African apartheid regime. But we have always stood firmly the ground of our just cause. Our conscience, therefore, tells us there is always a moral and legal dimensions to what states and non-state actors are bound to comply with to advance their legitimate causes. It is in this context that we find it important that we keep open the doors for peace, security, self-determination, and dignity for both the Israeli and the Palestinian peoples. We must pursue our efforts and consistently engage with the parties towards a sustainable and lasting solution. They recognized a long-standing need for a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security must be at the center of our efforts aimed at finding the path of peace and justice in the region. I thank you, Mr. President.
谢谢。下面我请马耳他代表发言。
Thank you, President. I also thank you, Dr. Tedros, for your very moving statement. And I also thank Mr. Gilani for his briefing on the humanitarian and health crisis in Gaza. Malta expresses grave concern at the continued deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Tens of thousands of injured, sick, and displaced civilians are sheltering in hospitals and schools, depending on their protected status under international law for safety. A relentless siege and daily aerial bombardments in one of the most densely populated places on earth means that there are no safe zones in Gaza. Yesterday's strikes against hospitals, including Al-Shifa, are deplorable. We emphasize once again that medical facilities, personnel, and ambulances are protected by international humanitarian law and should not be targeted. Just before this meeting started, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, informed us of active fighting in and around Al-Shifa Hospital. Inside, approximately 4,000 patients are in dire straits, not including those seeking shelter. The director of surgery has told us, and I quote, "We don't want to be killed here." As medical staff, they are staying for their patients and are desperately asking for our help. One of our roles in this chamber is to ensure medical staff can work without danger to their very lives. Meanwhile, the health system in the enclave is completely collapsed. The scarcity of medical supplies, fuel, water, and food are depriving people of the essentials for their survival and preventing treatment for severe wounds and illnesses. Critical patients are being operated on without anesthesia and on floors due to a lack of hospital beds. Compounding this situation is the severe damage to the water and sanitation infrastructure and the overall lack of nutrition available. This is leading to growing risks of severe disease for infants and children. Malta welcomes the Israeli government's announcement yesterday for daily pauses to ensure the safe operation of humanitarian corridors. However, we must also stress that to protect civilians in Gaza, longer sustained pauses are needed to allow for humanitarian actors to adequately access and address the rising needs of the civilian population. Such efforts must include urgent recovery operations for persons trapped under the rubble. Malta therefore reiterates its call for a humanitarian ceasefire and stresses the importance of adequate humanitarian pauses in leading up to this. We cannot speak of the humanitarian imperatives without adequately referring to the ongoing hostage situation. Over 200 people, including elderly, children, and even infants, are still being held against their will. Their families and friends suffer the agony of not knowing when or if they will be reunited with their loved ones. We reiterate our urgent demand for Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad to safely release all hostages immediately and unconditionally. Malta also reiterates its categorical condemnation of the unjustifiable terror attacks of 7th October by Hamas against Israel and her people, and the indiscriminate rocket fire which has continued to take place since. We underline Israel's right to protect its citizens from such acts of terror. We also stress that all actions to this end must be in line with international humanitarian law, including principles of distinction, proportionality, and military necessity. Malta also remains concerned at the threat of regional spillover of this conflict. This is particularly worrying in the West Bank, where violence and unrest has increased this past month. We call on all parties to avoid any actions or inflammatory rhetoric which can further inflame tensions during this heightened period. Forced displacement of Palestinians and related settler violence must also cease. President, I cannot fail to mention UNRWA's tireless work this past month, which has come at great cost of lives of over 100 heroic workers. We fully support the agency through these difficult times and underscore its dire need for funding. UNRWA was and remains a stabilizing force in the region. It is one of the only beacons of hope for the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. It is crucial that we continue to support it. In closing, President, Malta underscores its commitment to a lasting and sustainable peace in the Middle East, based on a two-state solution in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. We stress the need to refrain from conflating the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people with the terror tactics of Hamas. It is only through a fulfillment of the Palestinian people's inalienable rights, including to self-determination, that we can effectively relaunch a credible peace process. Thank you.
谢谢。我现在以中国代表的身份发言。我同样感谢谭德赛总干事、吉拉尼主任刚才所做的通报。此轮巴以冲突已经持续了35天，形势还在继续恶化之中。当包括4000多名儿童在内的上万人被夺去生命，当160多万人被迫逃离家园，当230万人持续被切断水电、燃油、食品、药品供应，当医院、学校、难民营、联合国设施频频成为袭击目标，这已不仅仅是一场人道危机，更是古特雷斯秘书长所说的人性危机。今天上午，我以安理会轮值主席的身份会见了巴勒斯坦和阿拉伯国家伊斯兰合作组织的代表。从他们的谈话中，我深切地感受到他们内心深处的伤痛，感受到他们对恢复和平的期盼，感受到他们对安理会采取切实行动的期待。面对这一切，全世界必须共同大声疾呼：该打住了！面对这一切，安理会必须排除个别国家的阻挠干扰，立即采取负责任、有意义的行动，坚守正义，维护和平。停火止战，刻不容缓。停火绝不是一个外交辞令，而是加沙民众活下去的唯一希望。我们呼吁各方，特别是对当事方有独特影响的大国，摒弃一切地缘政治考虑和双重标准，将一切努力汇聚到停火止战这一目标上来。我们敦促以色列遏制约旦河西岸愈演愈烈的定居点暴力，避免热点共振、冲突蔓延。保护平民刻不容缓。我们谴责一切针对平民的暴力和袭击，对在加沙发生的明显违反国际人道法的行为表示严重关切和坚决反对，敦促停止针对平民的集体惩罚。我们要求保障被扣押人员的人身安全和人道需求， 呼吁开展外交努力，推动相关人员尽早获释。拯救生命刻不容缓，有1300多名儿童和他们的家人被困在废墟之中，生死未卜。我们支持安理会就此采取紧急行动，推动实现连续数日的停战，立即开辟绿色通道，让专业机构和设备进入加沙开展搜救，尽最大努力拯救儿童。安理会还应该响应谭德赛总干事和拉扎里尼主任专员的共同呼吁，推动建立医疗后送机制，让加沙的孕妇和重伤重病人员得到及时转移和救治。恢复物资供应刻不容缓，我们呼吁以色列立即解除封锁，全面取消生存物资供应限制，特别是允许对人道、医疗机构及民生设施的燃油输送。过去2周，只有500多辆卡车通过拉法口岸进入加沙，这对在生命边缘挣扎的加沙民众只是杯水车薪。所有通向加沙的口岸都应当用起来。凯雷姆沙洛姆过境点应当尽快开放。各位同事，这些天我们还频频听到关于加沙未来的讨论。关于这一点，必须明确，关于加沙的任何安排都不能强加于巴勒斯坦人民。针对当前局势的任何解决办法都不能背离两国方案。巴勒斯坦的未来必须也只能由巴勒斯坦人民自己决定。中方愿继续同国际社会一道，为早日平息加沙战火，缓解加沙人道危机，实现巴以和平共处，实现中东长治久安，做出不懈努力。谢谢大家，我现在恢复行使安理会主席的职责。谭德赛先生请求再次发言，我现在请谭德赛先生发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. As I said earlier, in Gaza, nowhere and no one is safe. Imagine that you're trapped in that situation. Just imagination. So that's why we're asking for a ceasefire. We're asking for unfettered humanitarian access. And at the same time, of course, we're also asking for the UN Security Council to do everything for the release of the hostages. Then the second thing I would like to say is, because many of you have raised that issue, is the two-state solution. I visited Israel in 2014 when I was foreign minister. And if there was one thing that I underlined then, I said the Gaza situation is unsustainable. It's dangerous. And that Israel should make a solution. And that's the two-state solution. Of course, many say the two-state solution is good for Palestine. But I strongly believe that it's a very good and important solution for Israel too. And during that visit in 2014, what I said to my Israeli counterparts at the time is, please do it for your own sake. The two-state solution, a lasting solution. And I'm really glad, while addressing this acute condition, the UN Security Council is also underlining the long-term solution. So with that, thank you so much again for inviting me. I'm glad to be back to this room where I have been many times before. And the last thing which I said earlier, please take the UN Security Council reform central and real commitment, to be honest. Thank you so much, Mr. President, and back to you.
我感谢谭德赛先生所做的再次发言，也感谢他参加今天的会议，并做通报。在我的发言名单上没有其他人了，现在休会。